They were alone on a desolate rock in the middle of the North Atlantic, a place feared by sailors and shunned by locals for generations, and just before Christmas of 1900 they vanished. No sign, no struggle, just an empty lighthouse, and a mystery that still chills the bones over a century later. But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe, and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. In December of 1900, the Flannan Isles, a remote cluster of rocky islets off the western coast of Scotland, were anything but welcoming. For centuries, they'd been a place of superstition and fear. Locals called them cursed. Fishermen avoided them. Even shepherds, who brought their sheep to graze on the largest island, Eilean Moor, would never stay the night. But that year, the Flannan Isles would earn their place in history, not for myths or legends, but for the real-life disappearance of 3 men, whose fates remain unknown to this day. The story begins with a ship called the Hesperus, cutting its way through thick fog toward Eilean Moor. On board stood a man named Joseph Moore, a lighthouse keeper from the Isle of Lewis, returning to his post after a routine rotation. But this time, something was wrong. Very wrong. As the rocky silhouette of Eilean Moor loomed out of the mist, the lighthouse, perched high atop the cliffs, was dark. No beacon pierced the fog. No signal welcomed them. The massive light, meant to warn passing ships of the island's treacherous shores, had been dead for days. Moore stood silently at the prow, his eyes locked on the structure. Inside his gut, a knot twisted tighter with every passing second. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong ever since reports came in that the light had gone out. He had tried to dismiss it as weather or equipment failure. But now, with the lighthouse growing closer, his worst fears were becoming real. There was no flag flying from the station, no supply boxes waiting at the dock to be restocked, and most chilling of all, no one came out to greet the ship. Captain Harvey ordered the foghorn blown. The low, thunderous groan echoed against the cliffs. No response. They fired a signal rocket. Nothing. The island stood silent. Finally, Joseph Moore and a crewman named McCormick took a small launch to the east landing and climbed the steps up to the lighthouse. Moore was the first to enter, and what he found would stay with him for the rest of his life. The main gate and front door were both closed. Inside, everything appeared strangely normal. Too normal. The lamps were clean and refilled. The beds looked like someone had just gotten out of them. The plates were washed. The fire had gone cold, but the ashes were recent. An overturned chair in the kitchen hinted at something sudden, something violent, but there were no signs of a struggle. No blood, no bodies. Even more unsettling, all the clocks had stopped. Joseph returned to the ship and told the captain what he'd found. Soon, more men joined him for a thorough search of the island. That's when they made a disturbing discovery at the West Landing. There, the devastation told a violent story. A supply box, stored 110 feet above sea level, had been smashed open. Its contents scattered. Iron railings were bent. A heavy rock weighing more than a ton had been shifted from its place. And, even stranger, 2 sets of oilskins, the heavy protective gear the men wore in storms, were missing. The third set remained neatly by the entrance. That meant one of the men had gone out, without any protection. Who would do that in the middle of a brutal North Atlantic storm? The last entries in the Lighthouse logbook offered no help. The writing stopped on December 15th. 9 days before the Hesperus arrived. That was the day of a sudden storm. Violent, howling winds that could tear a man from the cliffs. And then, nothing. 3 men. James Ducat, 43. Thomas Marshall, 28. Donald MacArthur, 40. Gone, vanished into thin air. No bodies were ever found. No wreckage. No definitive signs of what happened. Just shattered gear, an abandoned lighthouse, and decades of questions. Over the years, wild theories emerged. Everything from sea monsters to alien abductions, secret military operations to ghost ships. One of the more grounded explanations suggests a rogue wave, a freak giant wave that could have swept all three men off the rocks in an instant. But if that's what happened, why was one man outside without any gear? Why were the others even at the landing in such conditions? Another theory? One of the men, possibly MacArthur, who was known for his short temper, snapped. Cabin fever, isolation, resentment. Some believe he killed the other two, then threw himself from the cliffs. But again, there's no evidence of a fight, no blood, no marks of violence. And then there's the vortex theory. Yes, you heard that right. Some researchers believe a rare atmospheric vortex could have created powerful, unpredictable winds that literally swept the men off the cliffs, one by one. It sounds far-fetched, until you realize that other lighthouse keepers reported being lifted off the ground by winds on that very island. But if that's true, why didn't it ever happen again? With the lighthouse now manned by Joseph Moore and 3 volunteer seamen, daily operations resumed. But the questions surrounding the fate of the missing keepers refused to fade. Back on the mainland, Captain Harvey sent a telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board. His words were chillingly simple. Dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers have disappeared. Speculation spread like wildfire. The press latched onto the story with a hunger for the bizarre. And soon, fictionalized accounts began replacing the truth. One popular myth claimed that a half-eaten meal was found on the table, left in a rush. Another said one of the men had written disturbing entries in the logbook, describing another crying, praying, and breaking down under the stress of the storm. It was dramatic, it was emotional, and it was completely false. Those entries, filled with fear, madness, and prayers, never existed. They were invented 21 years later by an American pulp magazine seeking to spice up the story for readers. But the damage was done. Even today, many people still believe those details to be real. What we do know is this. The lighthouse keepers made their last log entry around 9 a.m. on December 15th. A storm hit hard that day. When Moore arrived 10 days later, all signs pointed to a sudden and unexplained disappearance. Some believe there may have been tension among the men long before the storm. Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, was not a full-time lighthouse worker. He wasn't used to the grueling isolation of the Flannans. He had already spent over 2 months on the island by the time the superintendent, Robert Muirhead, visited on December 7th. It was unusual for a superintendent to visit in December, and some suggest it wasn't a routine check-in. It was to calm things down. Was there conflict? Did something snap? A darker theory suggests that MacArthur may have attacked his fellow keepers in a moment of rage, perhaps over something small that spiraled out of control. After realizing what he'd done, he may have thrown himself into the sea. But again, there's no evidence, no blood, no broken furniture, nothing. The most widely accepted explanation is perhaps the most tragic: a freak accident. Here's how it might have happened. During the storm, some of the equipment at the West Landing, essential ropes, cranes, and storage boxes, had been damaged by the wind and waves. 2 of the men, likely Ducat and Marshall, went down to the landing to secure or inspect the damage. Meanwhile, MacArthur stayed behind in the lighthouse, following protocol. Then something went wrong. Maybe one of the men got into trouble, slipped, got caught by a wave. In a panic, the other ran back up to the lighthouse, calling for help. MacArthur, thinking he'd only be outside for a moment, didn't bother putting on his oilskins. The 3 of them ended up at the landing, caught in the storm, just as a rogue wave surged over the rocks and swept all of them into the sea. It's a clean theory, logical. It explains why one set of gear was left behind, why the damage was so high up the cliffs, and why no one was ever found. But even this theory has its doubters. Lightkeepers across the UK have questioned why such experienced men would risk going out during such treacherous weather, especially so late in the day. James Ducat had over 20 years of experience. Why would he take that chance? Even more curious is the location of the damage. The smashed box was 110 feet above sea level. The iron railings were bent. A massive stone was displaced. And at over 200 feet, turf was stripped from the cliffside. What kind of wave does that? In recent years, a new idea has gained traction. In his book, The Lighthouse, author Keith McCloskey presents the vortex theory. According to this idea, a unique combination of topography and wind patterns around the lighthouse may have created a violent wind tunnel on that particular day. Because the walls around the west side of the lighthouse complex were lower, strong gusts could have funneled through the winch house area, lifting men off their feet and hurling them over the 200-foot cliffs, just 15 feet away. It sounds fantastical, but former lightkeepers stationed at the Flannans have confirmed that winds there can be unnaturally strong. Some even described being knocked over or lifted by gusts on calmer days. Still, it begs the question, if this happened once, why never again? The truth is, we'll probably never know what happened on that rock in the middle of the Atlantic. The lighthouse remained manned for 70 more years without incident. In 1971, it was fully automated, and today, it's only visited for maintenance. But the story lives on. Poems have been written, songs sung, operas composed, and documentaries produced, all trying to unravel the same question. What really happened to the keepers of the Flannan Isles? They were husbands, fathers, sons. They left home with the promise of returning in time for Christmas. But instead, they became part of one of the most haunting disappearances in maritime history. And now, over 120 years later, their names are etched into a mystery that refuses to fade.